One question I've had a chance to ask a lot of people on this show over the years is, what is a book that's changed your life? There are all kinds of answers to that question, from books that changed a career path, books that changed relationships to families, books that changed attitudes about health. Earlier this year, a book that changed a whole lot of lives right around the world celebrated its 80th anniversary. And our book's expert, Spencer Stuart, came by to tell me about it.
That's right. It's Alcoholics Anonymous book, also referred to as the Big Book. As of 2010, I think there's been about 3 million copies that have been printed since its publishing in April of 1939.
How did that publishing come to happen, Spencer?
Well, it begins with a gentleman by the name of Bill W. or Bill Wilson. Around the age of 40, he'd tried several attempts at getting sober or recovering from alcoholism. At that point, he met up with an old friend of his who was a member of the Oxford group. Bill W. will say later on that this was very much a group that inspired the structure of AA. It was a group that was based in New York and through the church and had really a sense of kind of duty to the process of recovery. Around that time, he was going to those meetings, and he was also trying to effectively recover from the Great Depression in terms of his professional life. He was someone who got involved in the stocks in the 1920s and became somewhat of a traveling salesman through the 30s. So during a trip to Akron, Ohio in 1935, a point at which he was concerned that he may relapse, he called the Oxford Group chapter's contact there, a woman by the name of Henrietta Siebling, who got him in touch with a gentleman who is fairly large to the AA story, a man by the name of Dr. Bob, or Robert Smith. They got in touch with one another and realized that it really helped them, the conversation that they'd had together. Around that time, again, in June of 1935, actually June 10th, 1935, was a period of time when Dr. Bob effectively had his last drink and entered into sobriety as well. That's the kind of origin story, or the founding date of AA. Because at that time, both of them were finding the Oxford group structure to be a little bit more domineering, and it had a hierarchical structure to it. And their thought was they could do something that was more, based on the members and their own decisions. There was a anonymity based around it, and sort of an idea of talking therapy.
Huh. And members helping each other more
That's
than
right.
The top-down kind of?
That's right.
Okay.
So, as long as everyone comes in with a commitment, that they're able to sort of have a conversation about their own personal stories and their own paths to recovery.
So tell me more about, I guess, what led to this idea of a very small democratic group dealing with this situation, these questions of addiction.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that Bill W. as well as Dr. Bob, they both are from Vermont, and it's often been said that they grew up in communities within Vermont that had grassroots political origins, and there is a tradition certainly in Vermont of this. So in forming the group, there was really very much an interest, I think, from both of them to have as much agency to the various members as possible. And so one might say that those are kind of early on, or there was early exposure to these growing up in those environments as kids in Vermont at the turn of the century, from the 19th into the 20th century. Bill W. has described AA in various ways as a benign anarchy, in the sense that it just keeps accommodating desired formats and pathways of the members that join, and in doing so, it doesn't sort of change the 12 steps, the 12 traditions, but it changes the way in which you access them and discuss them in the various meetings. So you could have ones that are more focused on the spiritual elements, or more that are focused on the stories, or whatever, what have you. So after the founding in 1935, fast forward to 1937, Dr. Bob and Bill W. start to realize that actually starting the medallion system of giving people their chips with
for various anniversaries.
That's right, to mark various anniversaries of their sobriety. That they had a core group of 40 people that had been sober for 2 years. And from that realization, they thought, well, we should get this down. We should write this down and create a book and maybe see if this is something that we can spread across the country. And so in 1938, Bill W. sort of embarks on that and starts to write what becomes known as the Big Book. And it does it in a very interesting way. He sort of writes the various stories and formulates the 12 steps, which become so applicable in a lot of different recovery programs.
So that's when those really came into being, was in the process of getting it down on paper?
That's right. And sort of working out, what were the steps that were working for them. And he was presenting the working manuscripts to members at meetings, both in Akron and in New York and in other areas. And there were suggestions being made and alterations and all the rest of it. And at the same time, he was receiving sort of financial support from a doctor who was specializing in alcoholism by the name of Charles Town, who had been doing stuff throughout the early 1900s around alcoholism. So at this point, they're also trying to raise money to actually get the book in print. And the way they do that is by doing stocks with the various members of AA. And so it's really a communal effort. There were, according to Bill W., in the process of writing this, there was really quite lively conversations about the book and how it should present itself and the stories that were included, the personal stories, to allow people to sort of identify with the paths of recovery. And from that lively debate, there was the formation of the book that was ultimately published in April of 1939.
I find it interesting, too, that as you described the development of the book, that really it was based in that grassroots kind of approach, too. The conversations around the wording, the conversations around how this was going to be described.
Yeah, actually recently there was one of the working manuscripts came up for auction from one of the collectors, Ken Roberts, who's sort of a well-known collector of AA material, and it eventually sold for $2.4 million. But
no kidding.
Yeah, it's extremely valuable cultural document. And what you find in that, and also correspondences between Dr. Bob and Bill W. during the process of writing it, and also other members who were corresponding during the process, is a huge amount of discussion of how to word it and how to keep it open. One of those discussions is the relationship to spirituality and these discussions of God, which the New York group, which was formed by Bill W., had more atheists in it, and there was sort of a discussion of not having that included. Whereas Dr. Bob's group in Akron was marked by its more spiritual elements. And there was found a kind of meeting between the two in this discussion of God as you know him, which can be interpreted as one's own will. And that really does open it up and allows it to be a more inclusive group, certainly.
What was it like then when the book appeared at first in 1939? Was it successful immediately?
It wasn't. There were a number of promises from publications that they were going to do little specials on it and things like that. The members that were investing in it, they really wanted to be a big production, and in doing so, they made sure that the printer, Cornwall Press, used the best paper, the thickest paper that they could, with the widest margins, which is actually where the origins of the name The Big Book comes from. It was originally referred to as the Big Red Book because of the color of the dust jacket itself. And so when this comes out, it was offered for $3.50, which is the equivalent buying power now of about $65.
Oh, gosh.
So it was an expensive production, and they had 4,560 copies or something of that number. And at that time, it was not moving off the shelves, and there weren't any kind of features really to get it out into the mainstream. What really changes the tide, though, is Liberty Magazine, which was sort of the second to the Saturday Evening Post as a kind of general interest magazine, doing a feature on the big book in September of 1939, which led to 800 inquiries and allowed for AA to actually make it through the year financially. At that point in time, they were really in trouble in terms of debt. So much so that Bill W.'s house was foreclosed by the bank during the summer. So there was a lot of pressure. After that point, 1939, you have the Liberty Magazine doing a cover. And in 1941, finally, the Saturday Evening Post does a story by Jack Alexander that leads to a massive explosion in membership. At that point, there were about 2,000 members in 1941, and after about 5 years after that story, there were close to 30,000 members. So it really started, the word started to get around, and contacts started to develop, and people becoming aware of meetings nearby started to bloom as well.
If you'd said to me, name some of the very significant books published in the early 20th century, I would never have thought of this book.
Yeah, it's one that, if you look on Library of Congress lists, Time Magazine published a list of the most influential books of the 20th century since Time Magazine was founded, and it's on the list there as well. It's been brought to the fore of the conversation in a way that allowed people to meet and be in a safe space where they can sort of talk about paths of recovery and their life stories.
That is Spencer Stuart, and he talks about books here on North by Northwest. He's an expert in helping people with their collections of books and otherwise, based in Vancouver. And he was talking about the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book, which celebrated its 80th anniversary this summer.